You're crouched by a fire 2 million years ago, raw meat in your hands. Your gut aches just chewing it. Hours of grinding, barely any energy absorbed. Then, someone drops it in the flames. Everything changes. Here's the thing nobody tells you. That single moment at the fire didn't just change dinner. It changed what a human brain was capable of becoming, and it happened faster than evolution should ever allow. Sit with that raw meat for a second. Not metaphorically, literally. Your jaw is working overtime. Your teeth are grinding through sinew and cartilage like they're trying to disassemble a tire. And this isn't a 5-minute meal. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, spend up to 6 hours a day just chewing. 6 hours. That's a part-time job with no lunch break. And at the end of it, their gut still only pulls out a fraction of the calories sitting right there in the food. That's the world your ancestors were living in. A world where eating was the main event of the day. Not something squeezed between other things. Not a meal you grab between meetings. The meal was the schedule. Wake up, forage, chew, 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 sleep, repeat. And it's a world that, on paper, should never have produced something like a modern human brain.
Here's why. The human brain is, metabolically speaking, an absolute glutton. It's about 2% of your body weight, and it burns roughly 20% of your daily energy. Just sitting there, thinking, doing brain things right now while you watch this. Compare that to a chimpanzee brain, which takes a much smaller cut of the energy pie, something closer to 8%. Same basic primate blueprint, wildly different electric bill. To build something like your brain on a raw food diet, chewed for 6 hours a day, digested slowly and inefficiently, the math doesn't work. You'd starve trying to afford it. Think of it like trying to run a supercomputer off a car battery. The hardware might exist, in theory. The power supply simply isn't there to run it. So something had to change. Something had to free up the energy. And in 1999, a Harvard primatologist named Richard Wrangham proposed an answer so simple, it almost sounds like a joke. We started cooking our food. That's it. That's the pitch. But the implications of that one habit are honestly kind of staggering. Because Wrangham wasn't just saying cooking made food taste better. He was saying cooking is the reason you have the brain you're using to watch this video right now. This is the cooking hypothesis. And here's where it gets interesting.
Back to the fire for a second. Picture that same scene. You, crouched, meat in hand, except now picture what happens after it hits the flame. The proteins denature. The connective tissue softens. The structure of the food itself starts to collapse before it ever touches your teeth. Cooking isn't just heat. Cooking is pre-digestion. You're outsourcing part of your own gut's job to a campfire. And that changes everything downstream. Chewing time drops. Chimps, 6 hours a day. Modern humans eating cooked food, about an hour. That's not a small improvement. That's a 5-hour surplus every single day that your ancestors suddenly had to spend on literally anything else. Finding food, making tools, raising offspring, thinking. But the bigger shift isn't time, it's energy extraction. Raw food is like trying to charge your phone through a frayed cable. Some power gets through, but most of it is lost in the connection. Cooked food is like plugging directly into the wall. In 2009, Wrangham and researcher Rachel Carmody ran an experiment on mice. Same calories on paper, but one group got raw meat, the other got cooked meat. The mice eating cooked meat gained significantly more weight. Same intake, more absorption. The food wasn't more caloric, it was more available. That's the whole trek. Here's the problem, though. If cooking was the key that unlocked the human brain, where's the fire? This is where the story gets messy. And honestly, this is where you should be a little suspicious of anyone who tells you it's simple. The clearest, undisputed archaeological evidence of controlled fire, hearths, ash layers, burned bone in patterns that couldn't happen by accident, dates to around 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. Solid, not really up for debate.
But Wangerham's hypothesis points not to 400,000 years ago. It points to roughly 1.9 million years ago, to a species called Homo erectus. And that's the problem. That's a gap of over 1 million years between the brain started changing and we can prove there was fire. So is the whole hypothesis just wrong? Not necessarily. Here's the twist nobody puts in the highlight reel. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially with fire. Fire doesn't fossilize. It doesn't leave bones. Early sporadic fire use, opportunistic, not yet a nightly ritual, could easily have existed for hundreds of thousands of years before it left the kind of thick, unambiguous ash layer that survives to be dug up today. The wildfire caught and nursed version of fire use is almost invisible in the archaeological record. The controlled hearth at every night version is what shows up at 400,000 years. Those can both be true at once, at different points on the same timeline. The honest answer is, we don't know exactly when the shift happened. What we do know is what happened to the body once it did. And that's where the real evidence lives. Not in ash, but in bone.
Call back again. The fire, the meat, your aching jaw. Now, zoom out from that scene and look at the skeleton standing behind it. Because Homo erectus, the species Wangham points to, looks nothing like the ape-like hominins that came before. Smaller teeth, a smaller, weaker jaw, and, this is the part that matters most, a dramatically smaller rib cage, which means a dramatically smaller gut. That last one is the key that unlocks the whole mechanism. It's called the expensive tissue hypothesis, proposed by researchers Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler in 1995, and it's one of those ideas that's so elegant, it almost feels unfair. Here's the logic. Your gut and your brain are both metabolically expensive organs. They're both high maintenance in energy terms, and a body only has so much energy income to spend. So if you want to afford a bigger brain, something else in that budget has to shrink to pay for it. Think of it like a household budget. You want to upgrade to a bigger, nicer apartment. Your brain, but your income hasn't changed. The only way to afford it is to cut spending somewhere else. And the biggest line item you can cut without dying is your digestive system. Because if your food is already partially broken down before it enters your mouth, if the fire's already done the grinding and the softening and the chemical unraveling, you don't need 6 feet of extra intestine to squeeze the calories out. You need less gut, which means you can afford more brain. That's the trade. Smaller gut, bigger brain. Same budget, different allocation. And you can actually see this trade happen in the fossils. Homo erectus shows up with a ribcage shaped like a barrel had a baby with a wine glass, narrow at the bottom, not the flared, pot-bellied shape you'd expect on an animal built to slowly ferment raw plant matter for hours. The gut got smaller right around the same time the skull started expanding. That's not a coincidence. That's a receipt. But the gut isn't the only thing that shrank. Look up from the ribcage, toward the face, and you'll find the same story written in miniature. Earlier hominids, species like Australopithecus, had enormous molars, thick enamel, and heavy, forward-jutting jaws built to survive a diet of tough, fibrous, barely processed plant matter. Chewing machines, essentially, with a skull built around the machinery. Homo erectus shows up with molars roughly a third smaller, a shorter face, and a jaw that no longer needs to be an industrial grinder. Anthropologist Daniel Lieberman and researcher Catherine Zink demonstrated this directly in a 2016 study. Cooked food, they found, requires dramatically less chewing force and fewer chewing cycles than raw food, even when the raw food is meat that's already been sliced with a stone tool. Less force needed over evolutionary time means less face needed to generate it. And a smaller retooled jaw does something else almost by accident. It starts freeing up real estate in the throat and mouth for finer motor control. That doesn't prove cooking caused language. That's a much bigger, much shakier claim, and a good chunk of anthropologists would tell you to slow down before you draw that line. But it's a genuinely interesting domino to notice sitting there, unresolved in the midst of this story. Shrink the jaw for digestion, and you may have accidentally built better real estate for speech. Here's the wild part, though. This isn't just an internal renovation. It rewired everything about how early humans lived. Because think about what a shrinking gut and a growing brain actually cost, structurally, when you're a mid-sized primate walking around without claws or fangs.
Your gut
used to be a slow and steady survival strategy. Chew constantly, digest slowly, always be eating, never run out. Once you shrink that gut, you've lost your buffer. You can't just graze all day anymore and coast on raw, low-quality food. You now need the energy-dense pre-processed meal. You need the fire. It stops being a lifestyle upgrade and becomes a biological dependency. Which means at some point, cooking stopped being optional. It became the price of admission for being human. And that dependency did something almost nobody talks about. It restructured the entire social world of early humans. Here's the shift. Cooking takes time and a stationary flame. You can't cook while running from a predator, and you can't cook alone and also gather the food and also watch for danger. So cooking created something raw foraging never required, a division of labor, and a reason to gather around a single fixed point at a predictable time of day. Anthropologists have pointed out that this is very likely the origin of something we now take completely for granted: the evening meal. Not just eating, gathering to eat. A shared, scheduled social event built around a fire every single night. That's not a small side effect. That's the first meeting, the first appointment, the first moment in human history where a group of individuals reliably showed up in the same place at the same time for a shared purpose that wasn't a hunt or an escape. And once food is being cooked instead of eaten on the spot, a brand new problem shows up. A problem that raw foraging basically never had to deal with: theft. If you're grazing on raw plants as you walk, there's nothing much worth stealing. You eat it as you find it, calorie by calorie, in real time. But a cooked meal is different. It sits there, finished, energy-dense, ready to eat, for minutes at a time while it cools. That's a target. That's a resource someone bigger or faster could simply walk over and take. Wrangham goes even further and argues that this single fact may have reshaped pair bonding itself. A cooked meal needed a guard, someone to stay at the fire, protect the food, and make sure the person doing the cooking wasn't just handing over hours of gathered effort to whoever wandered by. It created a reason for early humans to protect a shared food investment, and possibly a reason for early male-female partnerships to form specifically around defending a hearth and a meal, rather than defending a mate directly. That piece of the theory is more speculative. It's harder to test with bones and ash than a ribcage measurement is, so hold it a little more loosely than the gut-brain trade-off. Critics have pointed out that it leans hard on assumptions about early human relationships that are basically impossible to verify from fossils alone. But even in its weaker form, it points at the same big idea. The fire wasn't just cooking food, it was cooking society. Now, before the payoff, a quick, honest detour, because a good theory can survive its critics, and this one has plenty.
Not every anthropologist buys the cooking hypothesis wholesale. Some point out that plenty of the calorie gains Wrangham describes could come from something much less dramatic than fire, simply pounding raw meat and tubers with a stone tool before eating them. Smash something enough times, and you're doing a version of the same pre-digestion job cooking does, just with mechanical force instead of heat. No flame required, no 1,000-degree combustion, no controlled hearth. Just a rock. It's a fair point, and it matters, because it means the fire itself might not be the only explanation for the shrinking gut and growing brain. It might be one tool in a small toolkit of pre-digestion tricks, with stone pounding doing some of the early heavy lifting before fire use became reliable and widespread. The honest version of this story isn't fire alone built the human brain. It's closer to processing food by any method that reduced the work your gut had to do is what built the human brain. And fire turned out to be the most powerful version of that trick anyone ever found. Once it was available consistently, nothing else came close to matching what it could do to a piece of meat or a starchy root in a matter of minutes. Now here's where all three threads, the gut, the brain, the group, actually converge into the headline number. Between roughly 2 million years ago and the emergence of Homo sapiens
hominin brain size didn't just grow, it nearly tripled. A 2012 study by researchers Karina Fonseca Azevedo and Susanna Herculino Hosel modeled exactly what raw foraging alone could support, energetically, for a brain that size. And their conclusion was blunt. A raw diet simply could not have supplied enough calories to fuel a modern human brain's neuron count, not without spending over 9 hours a day eating. 9 hours. Every day. Forever. That's not a sustainable lifestyle for a social, mobile, tool-using primate. That's a full-time job with no time left over to become human. Cooking is what closed that gap. It's the loophole. It's the one variable that let a species keep the neuron count of a much larger animal while living inside the body and the eating schedule of a much smaller one. Put it side by side with a gorilla for a second, because the comparison is almost funny. Gorillas are bigger than us, stronger, heavier, more muscle by a wide margin, and their brains are roughly a third the size of a human brain, despite having the bigger body to work with. Herculino Hosel's research suggests the reason isn't a lack of ambition on evolution's part, it's a lack of fuel. A gorilla eats raw, fibrous, low-density plant matter almost all day, every day, and that diet simply caps how many neurons a body can afford to keep running. Humans found a workaround. We didn't get bigger. We got a better power supply. So here's the honest, unresolved edge of the story, because this genuinely isn't settled science. Some researchers argue the brain expansion started slightly before good evidence for widespread cooking, which would mean something else. Maybe just eating more meat raw, maybe stone tools doing some of the pre-digestion work instead of fire, kicked off the process first, with cooking accelerating it later rather than starting it.
It's less cooking flipped a single switch and more joining a trend that was already underway and then poured gasoline on it. Either way, the destination is the same. The gut shrinks, the brain grows. The species that emerges on the other side needs a burning log more than it needs a strong jaw. Back to you one last time. Fire, meat, hands. That ache in your jaw from a few minutes ago, that's not just discomfort. That's the ghost of an entire evolutionary bottleneck your ancestors had to escape. Every raw bite was a tax. Every hour of chewing was energy that could never go toward a bigger brain, a longer childhood, a more complex social group, language, art, any of it. And then the fire did something no gene, no mutation, no slow crawl of natural selection could do on its own. It changed the rules of the budget overnight. Evolutionarily speaking, it let a species keep spending on its most expensive organ by quietly, radically cutting costs somewhere else. That's why the timeline looks too fast. It's not that evolution broke its own rules. It's that cooking changed which rules applied. You're not looking at a campfire anymore. You're looking at the machine that built the brain reading this sentence right now. And somewhere, under all the noise of dates and hypotheses and half-finished evidence, there's a strange kind of poetry in it. The first thing humans ever really mastered wasn't fire itself. It was the art of making themselves easier to feed.